in this tutorial, we are using Adventure Creator to make an adventure game. And what we're doing in this tutorial is we're making so that with specific items or interactions in your game, it will display a different text. So with my sword, it should normally say use sword on whatever object I'm putting my sword on. However, if I put it onto my player, I want it to just say equip sword. Everything else is going to default to the use sword on object. So let's look at how to make this work. Now, first of all, let's go over the scene setup. I'm going to start on the player. The player has to have a hotspot. So here's the player's hotspot, and by default the label is set to self. And there's also an interaction set up for the sword, so the player will equip the sword when you click the sword onto the player. But of course a hotspot is required on the player. And then there is a script in here called the game controller, and the game controller is going to have just whatever you need for your game. But the part that's needed for the Adventure Creator actions is to integrate the Adventure Creator events. And so, of course, for that to work, you're going to have to be using AC for Adventure Creator, and then you can add these events. Now, the events that we need to add are, you can find them over here on the hotspot on the event manager under the hotspot section. And the ones that we need are hotspot select and hotspot deselect. These are the two events that are required here. So we could see that these two events are fired during the call on change hotspot function, and so here the hotspot selected is called and the hotspot deselect is called. So we want to add these events to our game. So what we're going to do is type, just like you see above this line, event manager, and then we want to call the exact name of the function that we find from the event manager. So that, of course, is on hotspot select and on hotspot deselect. So we're going to do plus equals, and then this is going to be equal to a function of our own inside of our own game controller script, or whatever script you're doing this in. And I just want to use the same exact function name, and I'm going to get a red line until I actually add this function. And we're going to want the same exact thing for the on hotspot deselect, and we'll do the same function on hotspot deselect. Now we're going to need to actually add these functions into our script. So I'm going to scroll down to right here. This is kind of where all the rest of the Adventure Creator events are defined, and we'll do a private void, and then we want this to be the same exact name, of course, as right here. And we need to make sure that it has the same parameters that the event does. So if we look at the event manager, it's calling the event with this hotspot, and that is a hotspot script. So over here we're going to need this to use a hotspot, and we'll just call that hotspot with the lowercase h. And now if we scroll back up to the top, the error should be gone here. This event is set up. I'm just going to copy and paste the function for select and rename it deselect. So now we have these two functions which are going to be fired when the cursor goes over a hotspot, that is hotspot select, and when the cursor leaves a hotspot, that is hotspot deselect. Now we just need to make this function change the text depending on which what the hotspot is. So I'm going to start off with if hotspot.name is equal to player. Then we can continue. So if I go to the hotspot, I should find on the player himself, we should find that the hotspot's name. So if we go look at the player himself, of course his game object's name is player, So that is checking to see if the hotspot is the player. Then we continue. The next one we're going to say is if Kickstarter dot runtime inventory and dot selected item. And the reason I'm doing this is because I only want this to happen when you've selected the sword. Any other object should just, say normally use flask on self if you were to put the flask onto the character. But for the sword, I just wanted to say equip sword. So we're going to say Kickstarter runtime inventory selected item is not equal to null, because that could be null if there's no selected item from the inventory. So if we know that there is a selected item from the inventory, let's just get a string. We'll call it current selected item, and that is going to be equal to, of course, Kickstarter runtime inventory selected item dot get, what's the function here? It's label. There we go. So we're going to get the label from the currently selected inventory item, and I'm going to say if that string current selected item is equal to sword, then we know that the player has the sword selected. So for the sword's label, of course, that is defined in the Adventure Creator inventory under sword, and here is the name and the label if not the name. So the label will be sword in that case. So if the current selected item is the sword, we know that the cursor is over the player's hotspot. We know that the currently selected item is the sword. So the next thing that we want to do is just change the text so that it says equip sword instead of use sword on self. Because if it says use sword on self, it sounds like the player's going to do a suicide. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a new function. Let's just go right below on hotspot deselect. And I'm going to call this function private void update, not fixed update, update item hover text. That's just my name for it. You can name it whatever you want. And it needs to accept 3 parameters: an inventory item, and we'll call it item. It also needs a string for the text 1 and a string for the text 2. And all we're going to do in this is update the text. And the text that we're updating is over here in the inventory tab. You need to check this boolean which says override use syntax. If you override the use syntax, then we can update this string and this string. These 2 strings are called hotspot prefix 1 and hotspot prefix 2. So for my inventory item, I want to set the hotspot prefix 1 dot label to the text 1 string that we pass in. And for the item dot hotspot prefix 2 dot label, we're going to set the text to text 2. So now we have a function that we can call at runtime that's going to update this parameter and this parameter. We just need to make sure that this override use syntax is set to true. So going back to the on hotspot select function, which is called when the cursor goes over the hotspot, we're now going to call this update item hover text, and it needs an inventory item and 2 strings. The inventory item will be the currently selected item, so that's Kickstarter runtime inventory selected item. And if I mouse over here, I can see that's an inventory item, so that definitely will work. And we're going to put the update the text to, we need to include 2 strings here. So the first string would be equip, and the second string we're going to leave blank. Now we're going to need to do the opposite when the item is deselected, so that we go back to our default syntax of use item on. So I'm just going to copy this entire function and paste it down here. So if the hotspot is the player and we have the sword equipped, then we want to update the item hover text to use on. So once the cursor's left the player's hotspot, it just goes back to the normal text. Now the problem that we're going to have here is once I pick up the sword, the player's going to still display that second text item, which will say self. So if I select the sword, I can use sword on any object and that text appears correctly. And if I put the sword over the player, it says equip sword self. Now I want to get rid of that word self, so it just says equip sword. So the last change that we're going to need to make is update the hotspot's name. So we want to update the name of the hotspot, and we already have a reference to the hotspot because of this reference. So we could just say hotspot.name, well, set name, and then we need to give it a new name. What seemed to work was just a space, because if the string is completely blank like this, it will default to the game object's name. So if we just give it a name of a space, then nothing will be displayed. And the next parameter we need is the integer line ID, which is the translation ID, a number set in the speech manager. I don't have any localization set up, so I just want to put that to 0. So when the cursor goes over the player, it's going to set this text to equip, and it's going to set the player's hotspot name to nothing. And then once the cursor leaves, we're going to need to put that hotspot name back to self. So now that we've done that, if we have the sword selected and the sword goes over the player's hotspot specifically, the text should be updated. So it says use sword on whatever, all the objects, it's just normal. And then if I go over the player, it says equip sword. And now if I go out, it goes back to the whatever it should say. And the next thing to check is to make sure that it says self for other objects. So if I select the lamp, it should say use lamp on self. Perfect. So use lamp on self, and if I use the sword, it just says equip sword. Alright, I hope this tutorial helped you out. I'm going to bring up the code one last time. These are the 3 functions that we're using to make this happen, and of course we have to define the event manager so that we have those events in our script. Thanks for watching. Put a like below if it helped you out. See you guys in the next video.